There's no such thing as effortlessly. I'd like to romanticize it and wax poetic and say, yeah, when you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. That is bullshit. You might work several days with no sleep. So, it's not all roses. It's never effortless.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hello, Rockstars. It's Lid Shaw, your host for Recording Studio Rockstars. I created this show to introduce you to real-world recording professionals to hear their stories and learn from their experiences so that you can take your records to the next level and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Matthew Weiss, a Grammy-nominated and Spellemann Award-winning engineer. He began his career assisting such notable engineers and producers as Bobby Eli, Mark Marshall, Denise Barbarita, and Ron St. Germaine. Matthew is a master of many mixing styles, and since I'm a closet DJ, I'm super excited to be learning more on this podcast about mixing hip-hop and EDM as well. His credits include Arrested Development, Snoop Dogg, Dizzy Rascal, Yuri Kane, Sonny Digital, Mega Ran, King Midas, Armageddon, Ronnie Spector, and too many more to mention here. Just this past year, Matthew also executive produced the self-titled album Soul Veggies, which debuted at number 47 on the Indie Billboard chart, number 97 on the Hip Hop Billboard chart, and number 188 on Billboard's Top 200, which is awesome. Most importantly for you rock stars is that Matthew loves teaching audio recording and mixing. He's appeared as a guest speaker at Cornell University, Pro Studio Live, and South by Southwest. And his audio education tutorials are among some of the best and most highly regarded that you will find. Matthew has teamed up with the Pro Audiophiles to create many courses teaching you everything from mixing hip-hop and EDM to rock and pop music. He also offers advanced courses diving deeper into topics like mixing rap vocals and hip-hop beats. When you are ready to learn by example, you will also enjoy Matthew's Mix Thru series, where you get to watch over his shoulder as he mixes an entire song from start to finish in real time. It's like getting to hang out in the studio with a master mixer for hours during a real mix. Matthew even stops along the way to explain every detail so you know not only what is going on, but why he is making all his mix decisions. Of course, I will include links to all of his products in the show notes and even the new all-inclusive membership site over at Pro Audiophiles. You can find the show notes at recordingstudiorockstars.com or by simply clicking through the show notes window of this podcast playing right now if you are on your iPhone or in iTunes. I'm super excited to have Mixmaster Matthew Weiss with us on Recording Studio Rockstars today. Matthew, my friend, are you ready to rock?
I am ready to rock.
Can you tell us in your own words who you are and more about you?
I am someone who seeks to make the best of a record. That's my goal, my passion, my emotional dedication. When I hear music, I want records to succeed. And I do everything that I can to do that, whether it's production, mixing. I'm getting my first A&R credits in February.
Wow, man, that's fantastic.
So that's me. And I've been doing this, if you want to draw lines, I've been doing this since 6th grade when everyone said, do you want to be in the school play? Do you want to be set designing the school play? And I said, I want to work the soundboard.
The AV department, as I recall, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. We didn't have the V part of the AV. We just sort of had a soundboard, and we felt pretty good about that.
That's cool, man. That's great. Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, too, I remember being really, really drawn to the tech aspects of things. Still am. So I understand that. So you talk about doing anything that it takes to get a record to a level of success. Have you also done like Sam Phillips? Do you drive around with a trunk full of vinyl in your car, taking it directly to music stores?
I have, not so much with vinyl, but I have put CDs into independent stores myself by hand.
What would you describe as a sort of a version of that in today's music market? I mean, is there a digital version of driving around with a trunk full of records?
No, there isn't, which is actually what makes that prospect of going that route more interesting and useful.
Yeah, indeed. And where would you take them to these days? I guess you just take them to independent record stores?
Well, at this point, I'm a little bit, I don't want to say past that because I don't think that part ever leaves, but just the direction of the hustle is a little different. So, for example, I'm doing I call it downstream production because I'm working with a songwriter/producer, but I'm helping the production along. So I'm doing additional writing, additional production and mixing, and then we'll be taking these 5 songs that we've come up with and flying out to LA and going around to all of my different contacts with a bunch of not for resales to be distributed among some of the industry insiders that I'm connected with. And it's the same thing. It's no different than going to the record stores and saying, hey, you should put this fantastic CD right on this little display here up at your counter, and trying to sell people on that idea.
That's very cool, man. I love that term, downstream production. It really explains this process that happens a lot today where there's so much that you can do after the music's been recorded.
Sure. I mean, that's what I think that I'm hired for. I mean, who cares if someone calls it mixing, mastering, writing, arranging, producing? It's all the same thing. It's all making the song work. And if I have to go into a different realm or vector to make that occur, then why not?
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about the styles of music you find yourself working on a lot now. And for example, the project you're talking about, what style of music is that?
That's pop records, and they're generally aimed for being purchased by a female pop artist.
Okay, cool. So can you start us off on this interview also with an inspirational quote, something to kind of get us going?
Yeah, I got one actually. Success is not a line that you cross. It's an act that you perpetuate.
That's cool. So in other words, success is not, you never arrive there. It's not an arrival point. It's the process always.
It's a continuation. It's not like, I think in the music business, we fool ourselves into think once I have a certain success and a single success occurs, then I will be successful. And from the point of view from someone who has had many single successes, I can tell you that those things alone never actually lead to a career, but it's rather the act of consistently pursuing more of those single successes that form a career.
What have you found as your experience of enjoyment? Have you found that you really enjoy it when you get the credits for the successes, or do you find that when you look back, you discover that you really enjoyed the pursuit of those successes the most?
The pursuit, easily. I mean, first of all, my credits don't get handled right very frequently. I'm miscredited or not credited probably as often as I'm credited. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, bragging rights are great, but nothing beats the experience that those bragging rights are derived from.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that's an important topic, always has been, and I'm very curious about what that really means for people today. Music is distributed in a way where there's not necessarily a front and back cover to the music you're listening to. How do you address accreditation? How important is it that you're credited for what you do? And how do you make sure that the right people know about it?
That's something I struggle with every day. I pretty much need to make it abundantly clear, almost borderline showboating in terms of just being adamant about what I've done, because so many of these digital distributions in particular, which is the norm today, there is no credit section, exactly what you were saying. So, and like companies like AllMusic will only honor credits that show up on a hard copy. And I don't even get the credits on the hard copies all the time. So it's like, getting the credits out there is very, very difficult. And so it's almost more useful to form the relationship with the artists that help those credits along, so that, if I need to talk to Speech from Arrested Development for whatever, I can call him up and say, hey, would you mind doing like a 10-second spot into your phone just to say, something nice about me? And I've never asked Speech to do this, but I'm sure he would. So, but it's more important even just to have the connection where it's like, I don't really need the credit if I can say like, no, you can call him, you can write him an email and he'll respond and he'll vouch for me. And that ends up going further when you're talking about, actively trying to form connections with people and labels and things like that.
Man, I think that's brilliant. I love how quickly you just came up with that idea too, which I haven't really heard anybody suggest before. I definitely am familiar with the idea of kind of writing your own credits. We live in a world of websites. You can put up your own discography. You can make sure that people who arrive at your site know what you've done. But I like how bold you are in approaching it, to just say, hey, why not ask the people you know so well to just simply give you a shout out?
Yeah. I mean, it's it goes further in a lot of ways, because not only does it show that you have a connection with this person, but also that they have a positive experience with that connection. And a credit doesn't do that. So,
yeah,
but I mean, it's also too, like, the relationships are more important because, I'll know and work with people like Speech or Dizzy for years. 10 years down the line, it's not like we're not going to know who we are.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so Matthew, let me jump to a little bit more of a storytelling question. You talk about the struggle of getting credits right, and that brings up the topic of like a failure along the way. You've achieved a great deal of successes and everything, but it's great for people who are on this path themselves and maybe at the beginning stages to sort of humanize it a little bit. Can you share a story about an important failure for you along the way?
Oh, I can think of a few. Well, the first one was back when I was assisting Mark. I had a great relationship. I still have a great relationship with Mark. Mark is a brilliant musician. He also has albinism, so he has trouble seeing, and he is deaf in one ear. And yet he's still an exceptional musician, despite all of that.
Wow.
And so as an assistant, he was oftentimes paying me. And he was, he really valued my work. And at the same time, budgets can always be tough. So this was maybe about a month into working with Mark, and this was my first really serious paying gig, and I ended up getting paid. I worked for it was 2 or 3 sessions, very long sessions. I think it was 3 days in a row, and I made $300, which is the most I had ever made at the time by far.
Yeah.
Off of this. It was like $100 a day. And I was commuting back and forth from Philly to do this assistantship in New York. And I hopped back on the Chinatown bus to go back from New York, and I fell asleep. And when I woke up, my wallet was gone.
Oh, no.
And it was pretty gut-wrenching, because that was a lot of money. That was a signifier that I could be doing it full time, and that I could get paid what I felt I was worth, and things like that. And it was something that put validity on my life choices, and then it was gone.
Yeah, and your payment for the session was in your wallet that's now gone.
Yes.
What a drag. So you were duly validified for your work and your value, and then immediately it was taken away from you, and you're back to ground zero again. What did you do?
I felt miserable about it, and then just reminded myself that whether or not the money was stolen, the act of getting the money could never be stolen. The fact that I had gotten myself in a position where I was being valued for my work could not be taken away from me. And that is more valuable, because now, the $300 10 years later is like, who cares, really?
Yeah,
it sucked, but whatever. But I have a career where I'm valued for my work, and that never disappeared. And I have another one, which is more of a personal failing one too, because that's one where sometimes external circumstances will really kick you in the nuts. Mm-hmm. But this is one where I sort of screwed up. And what happened was there was a documentary, and I got hired to do the post sound to clean it up. And I felt that the edits were done badly. So I volunteered. This was mistake number 1. I volunteered to reconstruct the edits, which over an 85-minute documentary is a terrible idea when you have a deadline.
Try an hour-long podcast. I know what you mean.
Well, so what goes into an hour-long podcast, and, multiply that by a lot more. Because we're talking about like a feature documentary that was going to Sundance, and there's like every bit, like negotiating between the ADR and the boom captures and the lav pickups and all this stuff, going between every scene. There's scene changes. Everything's changing within 10 seconds, because that's how modern film is. And so, this documentary ended up taking me a solid week to do, and I never left the studio that week except for to get food. I slept in the studio every night. And
wow.
And I agreed to do all of this for $1,500, which I totally undersold myself, which was mistake number 2.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you feel like you arrived at that? Because I think sometimes for us, identifying the process of arriving at making that mistake is good, because then we can see it when it comes.
Because I thought I wanted it more than I did. And it's very hard to see, like I'm very much, and actually I'll say this too. I don't think that in the bigger picture, I made any mistakes. Sorry about the fire truck.
That's all right. No, I think it's lending an element of, urgency to your story.
That's right. That's a drop sound effect. Sure. In the broader picture, it comes from this mentality that I've always had where when there's a way to say yes, I will. And I think that that's an important mentality to have, but it does lead to situations where sometimes you undersell yourself and within the microcosm of the situation, you don't do things right necessarily. But here's the one where I really got kicked. At the mistake number 3, I left a glitch in a scene where there was a congressional hearing regarding marijuana laws in this documentary, and there was a glitch left in. And because of this glitch, these people who have totally misused the concept of libertarianism to be the Donald Trump version, where if he doesn't like how the mic sounds, instead of realizing that he's too darn close to the mic, he says, I'm not going to pay the people that I've hired. So they said, we'll give you $500 and we're not giving you anything more.
Oh, no. I thought you were going to say that the right wing got a hold of the documentary and shot down the legalization of marijuana or something like that.
No. This was all
from the glitch being in
this there. Was all. I mean, the right wing already had the documentary. This was a documentary on libertarianism.
Right. Yeah. What a drag, though, that they wouldn't pay you, though.
Because they're terrible people who were hiring me, and for a long time I was really silent on it because we don't like to disrespect our clients, even when they do something wrong, because it paints an image of who we are as people as being negative people. Nobody likes to feel the brunt of confrontation. But I've mentioned the documentary by name. And so if the people who made that documentary ever hire you, just know that they might not pay you. And so get paid up front and ask for what you're worth, because you'll end up being overworked and underpaid if you let them. And so I think that was a personal failing on my part. I should have been more in control of the situation and said, look, if you're not going to pay me my full fee, then you're not going to get the sound, period. And you're on your own, use your own sounds. And instead, I didn't do that.
So have you found in your experience that you run into that kind of issue more often when it's dealing with a company or a bigger budget situation, or more often when you're dealing with individuals, one-on-one, independent artists?
It happens when you run into people who are cheap and broke. And that turns out to be every gamut. Because there are major companies that have changed management around during times when they've been cheap and broke, and they have screwed over a lot of people. But there's also plenty of independent people who they have these lofty dreams of building this huge project, but they don't realize the cost that can entail.
Yeah, well, I think it's good advice, though, to anybody when you deal with working for another client, is to be as clear as you can on the way in, be as clear as you can what the way out is going to look like. In other words, full payment equals delivery of the goods. And then just being very careful to determine just how hungry you think you are for a gig, so you don't undersell yourself when you should be getting your full value. And also the flip side, which is so you don't miss out on an opportunity when you really should just take it, even though it pays little. Because there are times in our careers where that's really important.
This is why I said that within the microcosm of that particular situation, I felt I made a bunch of mistakes. But in the bigger picture, the mentality that I was holding was, okay, this is a project. It's something that will enhance my credits. It's going into a realm that I could expand into. It's bridging a gap with a new whole set of people. And is the budget up to what I feel like I should be getting paid for locking myself in a studio for a week? No, maybe not, but it's not a number that isn't respectable. So yes, I'm going to do this. And I think going back in time, I would have probably made the same decision. And even going into the future, I will probably make similar decisions. And some of them are going to turn out to be mistakes. But the ones that turn out to work out for the better are so much more important than the ones that, we remember as failings.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, man, to remind us of how important the successes are. When something works right, it can launch a whole lot more opportunity than when something doesn't go right.
Sure. I mean, another way of putting it is there's probably maybe like 50 or 60 people or companies that I worked with over the years where I was either underpaid or not paid at all. And I can maybe remember like 10 of them. But there's a few people where the ones that I do remember, things worked out. And the significance of, like with Mega Ran, the guy whose name I was helping you pronounce,
Right.
He's somebody that I started working with for no charge, and I never received any kind of payment working with him until he started making significant money doing what he was doing. And now he does, and now I get paid, and now he's taken me to Europe, and now he's connected me with a bunch of really famous rappers who pay me. And, now my name is very well accredited.
Yeah.
And I've shown up in, viral music videos and things like that with cameos and stuff like that. Like, there's those things end up counting for just so much more.
Did you have to go shopping and get yourself some heavy gold chains or anything like that? Or did
No,
you
I already had
that?
Yeah, I just I got into a fight with Mr. T, and he won, but I grabbed the entire rack of chains over his neck before I ran away.
Well, that's better than going topless down in New Orleans for Mardi Gras in order to get him, So, all right, Matthew, says me. So sorry to be so silly, man. That's just my nature. Let me ask you this. Tell us about an exciting success for you, something along the way that really you just felt like you're on top of the world and it all came together.
Well, I'm a naturally cynical person, so I never feel like I'm on top of the world, but I do feel like there are certain moments where I did things right and it worked. And one that readily comes to mind was just the same go-getter attitude is sort of what propelled me. A guy that I was working with, again, for no charge, somebody I've known since the early 2000s, a producer who helps me with my tutorials. And I was working with him, and he said, hey, let's go down to Florida for an event. And I said, all right, cool. And he said, I can't pay your travel. I was like, all right, screw it. Let's go. So we go down to Miami, and we do this event, and I connect with another producer. And the producer takes me into all of these studios where I'm now getting to, get some rapport with some of the studio guys down in Miami, which is cool because I'd never really been to Miami in any kind of a business way. So first of all, I'm already forming connections, and connections are never a bad thing. The second thing is that we all get back into one of the studios, and we decide we're just going to work on a record. It's some demo stuff for some big name rapper guys, and let's just do it. Let's just get in there. I'm not asking about money. I'm not trying to even think of it in those terms. And down the hall, I hear somebody playing Dizzy Rascal records, which I think is awesome because that's somebody that I was really into in high school. And not too many people in the States know who that is, but overseas, he's absolutely humongous. So I knocked on the door because I wanted to see who was playing these records, and it was Dizzy Rascal. So I was like, oh, this is really cool. I was not expecting you to actually be here. And he said, yeah, here I am. And I said, oh, well, you should, when you're finished up your session, pop on out down the hall. We're doing some pre-production stuff for some other big name guys. And maybe you want to give a secret listen to it before anybody else hears it. And he stopped by and he liked a couple records. He said, let's go up to the bigger studio and let's audition some records and let's work on something. So I ended up doing, I think, 4 or 5 tracking sessions with him, and he paid me really well. And one of the records came out, and the other ones will probably never see the light of day, but such is life. But I mean, it was one of those things where it was like, I stopped worrying about the minutia of, is everything going to work out right? Am I going to get screwed like in this stupid film? And I just said, no, you know what? I'm just going to do this. I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to put myself out there, and I'm going to try and do everything to the best of my ability and represent myself well. And it turned out it paid off.
Okay, so I think that's important that you bring that up because I have felt very aware of this, and I feel like it's an ongoing question, which is, when you're faced with these choices of different things you could put all this energy and effort into creating, one of them you're going to sleep on the floor of the control room for a week to try and get it done. Another one you're going to take a trip down to Miami and, go around meeting people, and maybe that's scary even to go meet people at first. But have you noticed that there is that correlation between when you're true to your own heart and like what you're passionate about, that the successes come more effortlessly? I can't even say that right. More effortlessly. Maybe I'm not passionate about that word.
Maybe not. Maybe you need to start popping open the thesaurus and looking at some synonyms.
Oh, man.
Widen your range. No, there's no such thing as effortlessly. I'd like to romanticize it and wax poetic and say, yeah, when you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. That is bullshit. You might work several days with no sleep. So, it's not all roses. It's never effortless. And I'll be honest, I am terrified of introducing myself to people. And I'm a very confident person. For anybody who I'm almost too confident, I have more confidence than I think the average person, and probably more than I should. So I think the average person is probably even scarier. But you have to suck it up and go, you know what? I am going to introduce myself to this person out of the blue, say who I am, what I'm doing, what I think of them, and ask for a connection, ask for an email, ask for a phone number. It's like going up to somebody that you're attracted to and asking for a date, except for, it's your career as opposed to your love life.
And except for hopefully they pay you instead of you paying for dinner. No, whatever. So
sometimes.
So Matthew, sometimes. Let me go into stuff that you're into right now. Tell us about what's exciting for you right now, whether it's, projects that you're in the middle of this year or whether it's stuff you're working on. We haven't even talked about your incredible tutorials and teaching yet.
Well, maybe we'll segue in this moment. We'll drop a seg.
Let's drop a seg.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm excited about. There's a lot of big name people that I've connected with, and there's also a lot of people that I think will really get their music out there and become big name people that are maybe not well known yet. There's a punk rock guy who flew in from China to work with me, and that's been a lot of fun. He's totally crazy, and we're just making really raucous, edgy music, and it's great.
Very cool. Is that in English or is that in Mandarin or Cantonese or something?
Mandarin. It's Beijing. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's Cantonese. I don't speak Chinese. And actually, he doesn't speak a lot of English, which is making the sessions really interesting.
I've done a Japanese record in the past, and we found that we would have a notepad by the talkback button, and we would just learn and write down Japanese phrases, phonetically spelled out, so that we could have some form of communication.
Google has been a lifesaver. There's this project where I'm producing the pop records that myself and the producer Joe Lowry intend to shop out in LA. That's been a lot of fun. I'm doing some string arrangements for that pretty soon. And that's, I haven't done a string arrangement since I was in college, but I feel cool. Good about it. I feel like I know where this record needs to go and I can hear it in my head. So I feel really good about it. And plus we're using actual string players, an actual string ensemble. And that's so rare and so wonderful.
That's really cool. Can I cut you off right there
Sure.
and ask you a little bit about, I wasn't expecting to ask you this, but tell us how you arrange strings. What is that in a paragraph? What's that process?
The art of arranging strings is deciding what they're doing in the record. Are they meant to augment the chord movement, or are they meant to augment the melody, or are they going to do both? And usually it's a combination of all things at different times. So, I might fill in some of the sometimes you want to, there's so much to arranging, but one thing that I intend to do with it is the melody has this sort of cyclical way that most pop records do, and I want to accent the chord movement, how it exists in the melody at the beginning of each bar using pizzicato harmonies in the string section, little plucks. If all of that was Japanese to you, then I get the Google out because I can't teach it.
Yeah.
We'd be on the phone for an hour and a half if I were to try and get into all of the explicit stuff. But that's in the more open sections. When it comes into the bigger sections, I plan to use the strings not just in terms of the compositional arrangement, but also in terms of the actual soundscape arrangement. I can make the record bigger and depthier and wider by adding in these string parts that cusp around the stereo image of the record. And so a lot of it isn't even about doing anything complicated. It's just going to be refiguring the chords. But in doing so, I will be able to create a very scopic sensibility, which is a big part of the point. And then there's also melodic cadences that I think are really, really well written. Joe is a phenomenal top line writer. He is absolutely ridiculously amazing. He can make things sound like you've never heard them before and like you've heard them all your life at the same time.
Wow.
And so I want to I want to mark his cadences using the string elements, either by literally copying the movement or by doing something that leads into that movement or accents that movement in some way, shape, or form.
That's very cool. How do you go from idea to a real string player playing it? Do you start with a MIDI keyboard? Do you sit down at a piano? Do you write out all the music by hand, or do you use digital tools?
I'm going to start
sort of
on
thing?
piano, and then I am going to, my girlfriend is a violinist. She's primarily a singer, but she also plays violin. So I will have the privilege of being able to hear what I played out on piano voiced in a string, but then I'm going to notate it, and I'm going to give it to the string players, and I'm going to say, is any of this going to be difficult to play? Is any of this stuff that I've written going to impede your ability to make sure the lines connect, make sure everything feels gelled and connected? So I'm gonna rely on the string players to be able to read the music and tell me if I screwed up, because I'm not a string player, and again, I haven't done a string arrangement, and like, I'm not the type of person who believes like everything must be virtuosic. I'd rather be able to get clean, clear emotional impact rather than compositional fluff and wow factor. So that would be the next step. And then training it to the backdrop of the record, like, doing like a scratch kind of thing in a rehearsal, and then hitting the studio. Because most of the string players, I'm not going to be writing anything that's absolutely nonsense. It's going to be something that most, conservatory level string players would be able to look at and play in their first go.
By the way, I love that. What was that line you just said? I've lost it already, but it was something about fluff, and the other one. You just got dropping these great quotes.
It was something along the lines of, I want what really translates. I want the virtuosity of the record to be the emotional delivery, not the coolness of how this guy switched into like a tapped harmonic on one string, but it was the fundamental tone on the other string. And wow, it's so cool to do that and work that. No one cares.
Right on. Well, let me ask you this. So did you learn music and musical composition and writing music back in school or something? Can you actually write out music?
I can read and write music. I went to school originally for literary writing when I went into college. And then I switched over to math and physics, and then I decided I was happy being a hippie bum and switched into music.
Right.
And when I switched into music, I had never played an instrument in my life.
Wow.
So, but I had been writing music in sequencers and DAWs and using drum machines and synthesizers, that like little, cheapo synthesizers and stuff like that. I had been doing that for a number of years. So the transition made sense to me. Like, I was able to get respectable on piano, although I've totally lost it at this point. Like, now it's strictly, writing purposes only. But I was able to get some chops up on the piano, and I was able to write notes, because for me, it was like going from speaking English to speaking Spanish. It's a little weird until you start getting used to it, and then you realize the languages are very similar.
I think that's really inspiring that you went from kind of, music production from within the computer, in the box, even though you might have been using external synths, to saying, I'm going to go into school and learn music and get a music degree. Well, so my next question following that would be, what advice do you have for people who are listening? So rock stars listening in may not feel, they might get a little intimidated by that. They might say, wow, that's amazing. He's composing for strings, but I guess I must not be cut out for making records because I don't know anything about writing and reading music.
But well, first of all, you gotta, if you feel that way, maybe the appropriate response is to dig your nose in some books and do some work. Like, it's not like you can just sit. I'm not believe me when I say this, I'm not a brilliant, savant when it comes to anything in life. I just happen to have a very analytical and borderline anal kind of approach to things, where if I'm going to do something, I have to get good at it. And, even if that means I'm just doing this for 8 hours a day for months on end, then that's what it is. And so, if you feel like, okay, that's intimidating, well, I can offer pleasantries, but that's not going to change reality. And the other thing is that, if you listen to a lot of music and you enjoy music and you digest music in a way on both levels, emotional, casual listening, analytical listening, technical listening, all of that, then reproducing that is simply adjusting to the format. You're no longer receiving input. You are now creating output. And it's not really it's not a weird transition.
Yeah. Okay. So a version of that for me would be like I hinted at in the beginning of the intro, that I'm a closet DJ, right? So I have this passion for listening to electronic music, EDM, hip hop, and I love those sounds and I love the way that comes together. I think one of the first bands that I discovered that really turned me on to that was Crystal Method. And so I want to hit you with a couple of questions, if you don't mind, because I think that difference you described is, I've got the understanding of what I like about the sound, but I don't necessarily always know the ways to get to some of those sounds. So do you mind if I ask you a few questions about kind of, how you treat hip hop and
No,
EDM?
I don't mind at all.
Okay, great. Well, so as far as EDM goes, one question that I've always been curious about is, you've got this incredible pumping, breathing sound that goes on in dance music that just makes it sound like there's a giant party going on right in front of your face, What is that? How would you describe that? How do you explain to somebody what that sound is and maybe how they go from the first thing that comes out of their Logic Pro X when they just drag a loop over to arriving at something that's sort of exciting and pumping like that?
Well, traditionally, that's achieved through a method called sidechain compression, where a compressor normally reacts to, I'm assuming your listeners all know what a compressor is.
Yeah.
Okay. So a compressor normally reacts to the signal that is coming into the input. But there's actually two circuits in a compressor. One is called the detector circuit, and one is the actual output, the signal path circuit. And so your detector circuit is what's going to tell the compressor how to act. And the detector circuit is oftentimes fed by the same input. However, a lot of compressors have an open detector circuit called a sidechain. And the sidechain will allow you to put any source in there. It will default most of the time to the input signal, but a lot of them can be configured so that you can trigger a compressor with a completely different source. So if you have a bass and you want to give it that pumping motion in time with the record, the way that that's traditionally been done has been to take the kick drum, create a secondary output like a send out from the kick channel, and route that into the detector circuit of the compressor. So the compressor's action is based on the kick drum feeding it. But what's being processed is the bass signal. And this will create an envelope where every time the kick hits, the bass will dip down in level. And then depending on the setting for the release, it will return with a certain arc going upward. So it creates this reverse swelling kind of effect. And that's called pumping. And
yeah, that's the sound of the bass just going, like getting loud and disappearing and getting loud and disappearing with every kick.
Yeah,
drum
the other
hit,
technical term for it is whoop, 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 whoop.
Exactly.
All right. That's only for people who are really into jargon.
Exactly. Those aren't the words that you used when you were trying to ask the girl out on a date, as we were discussing earlier, right?
That's usually what I do is, well, first of all, I walk as if I'm pumping. So I will run forward and then I'll just dip back real quick. And then I'll run forward with a certain speed and then I'll dip back even faster. So I do that first and then I start making strange noises.
Whoop,
yeah.
Whoop, whoop. Okay, so let me ask you this too. I get that, and that's awesome, and thank you for that explanation. I think listeners will love hearing that too. What in electronic dance music is it just sort of the bass that's getting that treatment and gives it that thing, or when you start an EDM mix, do you kind of put a compressor across everything and get it ready to sidechain it, and you just experiment and try things out?
No, now it's more of like everything that gets that sort of a treatment, not just the bass. Traditionally, it will be just the bass, or it will be just the bass and rhythmic elements. But at this point in EDM, it's like basically everything, with the exception of maybe the vocals. But even like the reverb returns off of the vocals will oftentimes be set to duck in this manner. At this point, I don't really do this using a compressor for a number of reasons. I will do this using automation. And the reason being is that when you're doing this with a compressor, First, you are by default imparting the sound of the compressor on everything that is getting the treatment. And sometimes you don't want that. The other thing is that you're very much dependent on the action of the compressor and the shape of the kick in order to get the pumping motion that you get. And I would prefer to sculpt the pumping motion that I feel fits the rhythm of the record the most.
So now what are some tools that you use to do that sculpting? Are they the pencil tool and drawing different shaped lines, or is there some other tool that makes it easy to push it this way, push it that way, try some stuff out till you find the right feel?
I really like a plugin called Volume Shaper by a company called Cable Guys. It's a inexpensive plugin. It's very simple to use, and all it is you create automation shapes and you sequence them. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So in an EDM record, you would set your time frame to quarter note. You would draw the action of what you want the envelope to do. And there's a mix knob on it. So once you get the rhythm right and the pulse feels right, then you just adjust the mix knob so that you're not doing a deeper amount of pumping than you would necessarily want.
Dude, that is pure gold. And I mean, I have mentioned that I'm a closet DJ. I may have to just end this podcast interview early so that I can go try that out right now.
It's really cool.
That's great, man. All right, so let me see if I can hit you with another good one. What about hip-hop music? When you're mixing hip-hop, are you using a lot of the same EDM tricks, or is it really a different thing?
No, not so often. Some of it, there's a little bit of crossover just because genre-wise there's been a little bit of crossover. So it might be a little more common where I will maybe duck a bass for a short term from the attack of the kick. But that's not so much to create a pumping motion as it is to sort of just allow the attack of the kick to be more articulated. But I tend to connect things in a very different way because the pumping movement really relies on a very standard rhythm. Like a 4 on the floor type of thing is really perfect for that sort of approach. And in hip hop, you get composite rhythms. Everything is based on these sort of it's primarily all 4/4 figures, but it's still like kind of almost polyrhythmic in the way that it's layered because you'll have, like a break. And then underneath that, you'll have a sequence of a kick and a snare and, maybe some accenting cymbals. And all of these are creating these contrasting rhythms. And you need to figure out where those rhythms need to be reacting to each other. So it's a more complicated structure, rhythmically speaking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've got one last question about EDM, and then I'm going to go to hip-hop again, because I want something else I want to ask you. But in EDM, you've got this, the Volume Shaper is this amazing tool, so that's gold. Again, thank you for that, for shaping that sound of all the other elements. But what about the kick? Does the kick get some kind of crazy compression all the time, or is that one of the elements that's just sort of has a free highway right through the mix all the way to the master bus?
It usually if the EDM producers tend to be very particular about their kicks, because the kick is going to be by far the dominant element in the record. It's a dance record, so it sort of makes sense. And so, a lot of times the guys I'm working with are so thoughtful about the kicks that they're choosing. The only processing that I will really do with any regular basis is that I will make sure that the phase relationship between multiple kicks is really, really tight. Mm-hmm. But if I can get away with not EQing the kick in any way, not compressing the kick in any way, then, chances are that the producer selected it with good taste. That said, that doesn't always happen, or sometimes I'll feel like, to really keep up with the Joneses, we need a kick that just hits harder. And I do have certain techniques and approaches for doing that, depending on what the kick may need.
Okay, and this is the kind of stuff that you cover in some of your courses, your EDM courses and Mix Through series?
Correct.
Awesome. Well, we'll talk more about that here in just a sec. But so now let me just jump back to hip hop, ask one last question about that. One thing that I've noticed in hip hop is perhaps if I've ever tried to come up with a beat myself, I might be playing something that immediately gets quantized and all of a sudden I don't like it so much anymore. Is there a thing about getting really good hip hop beats that says you got to forget about the grid? Oh,
absolutely. Because think about this. Most of hip hop, at least in the foundational stages, minus like your Grandmaster Flash kind of stuff, it was sample based. Mm-hmm. And samples are played live. They were at one point ostensibly a band that was playing and grooving, and someone's cut a snippet of that and looped it. Are those guys on a grid?
No, well, no, the human grid.
That's right, the human grid. Even if they're feeding a click track, the fact is that there's a live pocket, and the pocket is not a metronome. There's push, there's pull, there's changes in dynamic. And so if you try and sequence something right up against the grid, it's not going to blend right. And on top of that, grids just aren't that exciting. Like, nobody's putting up their Lindrum sequence and, rocking out to that because it sounds really static and it's boring. And
Sorry, Prince.
Yeah, well, Prince gets a pass because he's so phenomenal at playing every freaking instrument that he could put a click track down as his only drum, and everything else will still sound fantastic, and it will be an awesome record.
Yeah, well, he may have been playing his Lindrum samples in by hand anyway. Who knows?
He probably was, but maybe not. There were definitely a lot of, there were a lot of Tears for Fears records where the drum lines were all completely sequenced to be microscopically in time.
Yeah.
But, like Shout comes to mind, and there's a whole bunch of other ones. But I mean, that was common in the 80s, but everything else was moving around it. So, I mean, there's still some sense of pocket and movement. And also part of the idea was to acknowledge the metronomic quality of it. But I mean, when you dig into hip hop, we're talking about breaks. That's like a live drummer. And, but there is some sequenced hip hop too. A lot of the trap music is like straight up sequenced.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. It's a really ambiguous thing, but I find that the intention of drums are not to be boring.
Yeah.
So if what you're doing makes them boring, you've definitely done it wrong.
You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Do it again. Can you tell us about the products, the tutorials you've got? You have this amazing resource for people who want to learn more about mixing, production, I believe, just the different elements that you're teaching about. And also, I have to tell you, Matthew, hearing you describe this stuff, I love how you just dive right in and you're like, no bullshit, just really talking about it from the heart. So I appreciate that.
I try, and I spend a lot of time in the tutorials, because I do heavy editing, to be thorough and dense. So a lot of these tutorials are pretty long. Some of them go as long as like 4 hours, but every second is pretty meticulously inspected.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm packing like 16 hours of stuff into 4 hours. I really, because I don't have a lot of attention for long-winded stuff, and I can be long-winded, so I try and watch that. But anyway, the idea of the tutorials is that I feel like I'm a good teacher. This has been reaffirmed a few times, and I was already writing a lot of articles. I was on web forums answering people's questions. Dan, who runs the Pro Audio Files, he hired me on to write articles dedicated to mixing. And I feel like it was a natural extension of both my desire and talent for teaching and my passion for music to start creating something for people who want to do this themselves as a resource to help them along.
Okay, and so a lot of the products or the courses, you've got written material, but a lot of these are also video courses where you can watch through. And what does that look like when you're taking one of these courses?
Well, there's a few different formats for them, and I try and create different formats because people learn differently. But the main format, and the one that I originally started with, was sort of like extended expose, where it's a lesson, a curriculum, and the music that's used is ultimately used to simply exemplify principles. And so I can explain like, oh, this is what it means to sit a kick drum higher or lower in the top to bottom image of your mix. And then I can take the kick and I can do it. And I can go through all of these topics that I feel are relevant to a certain genre or a certain style or approach. And over the course of, 2 to 3 hours, map the entire ideology out with tangible examples. That said, that's not for everybody, or that will only paint so much of the picture because a lot of it is idea-based. So I also came up with a secondary concept called a mix through, where it's simply based on observing me put these ideas into practice, like how I come up with stuff on the spur of the moment as I'm just allowing the record to hit me. And for some people, originally the impetus for that was, let's give people the knowledge, and then as supplementary material, show them examples of how it's being used on the fly. But for some people, it's actually more valuable to simply just pull it in from how it's being done on the fly again and again and again with different examples.
Yeah, it's kind of like interning.
Yes, exactly. It's attempting my very best to fill in for the dying space that is the intern and assistantship position.
Yeah, it's a sad moment. Should we have a pause, a moment of silence?
I think we should.
Okay, that's good enough. This is a live podcast. So,
all right, that's forever.
All right. So, Matthew, now what about for somebody who's coming to this? What if they're a beginner? Do you teach, you wisely asked earlier, you said, do listeners know what a compressor is? So do you also teach what EQ is, what compression is, what the effects are, so that they can then get to the next level of the courses and then to the level of mix through? I
do, but I want to qualify that I don't always like to think of things in terms of inexperienced to experienced or, novice to pro, because this is creating a set of ideas that rarely applies in full to anybody. There are people who have been using compressors for years who have literally no clue how they work. They just get a sensibility of what they're doing and they decide to use it, and they tend to be very good at it, but if I were to open one up, they would look at it and be like, yeah, that don't make sense.
Yeah. Can I just use for an example the entire world and our cell phones? You know what I mean? Like we're all experts, but we don't have a clue how they really work. So there you go. Makes perfect sense.
But that's a good example, because I used to say that, I can work $100,000 SSLG console, but I cannot figure out my phone. And that's still true to this day. So it's like, I know people who have not only successfully launched platinum records, but also have almost never used a recording console.
Yeah.
Is that person an amateur or a pro? Is that person a beginner or are they an expert? It's not so easy to see it. So what I want to do is whenever I'm explaining something that's, a fundamental signal processor like a compressor, what I want to do is explain it in a way where I can articulate for everybody what it's truly doing and how to interpret that not just on a technical level, which I think is important and I'll explain, but also in terms of how it works musically, how it affects the way the listener is going to ingest the record on a non-technical level. And I think when I put things in that frame, whether you're a beginner or you're in the middle or you build the darn things, there's something to be learned from it. And the example is this: the majority of the people who are buying my tutorials and reaching out to me are beginners, because the majority of people are beginners. But there are still exceptionally famous people. If I name dropped who was buying my tutorials, you would probably lose your mind. People who are like mixing for Justin Bieber have reached out to me and been like, I loved your tutorial. And my response has been like, great, when do I get to see yours?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm pretty sure you're a better engineer than I am. But the point is that there's still something to be learned and something to be taught.
Yeah.
So I think that's where my sentence ends.
No, but that's great, because I think that you also point out that a lot of people watching the tutorials are beginners, and that's because when we're in the beginner mind, which is a good place to be always, we're already accepting, hey, I'm going to go learn. But truly, like, it's a great satisfying pleasure to just be learning all the time. I love going and learning new stuff. And I'm always surprised at every opportunity there is to learn. So like the more expert I become at something or think that I'm expert, I go and I watch something that's maybe beginner, well, let's just drop those terms. I go watch something that I think might be, that maybe I already know. And then I realize I'm like, oh, that really got me thinking. I learned something new about this, or I saw compressors in a new way, or whatever it is. And it sounds like you're inviting listeners to check out your stuff, and you can kind of jump in anywhere and you're going to get great value out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, let me give you an example right now, and let's see if I'm on the mark with this. Let me go out on a limb and say that you've probably used reverb before.
I have used some reverb, yes.
Okay. So when you think of reverb, how do you conceptualize it?
It's 3 points on my patch bay. 1 sends to the plate reverb and 2 return from the plate reverb.
Okay, well let me rephrase it. What do you use it? What do you use it for?
Hold on, I got to answer your question with a really good anecdote though, because a bass player in my band, he said he was at the music store one day. We're in Nashville, Tennessee. Right. He was at the music store. He heard a couple of guys, a store salesman, talking to another guy, and he's like, "Hey man, what's this here? What's the reverb knob on this amp? Well, like what's that?" And the guy goes, "Oh man, that's like, you go stand in front of a barn door, it's wide open, and you just yell, ah."
Yes.
So there you go. That's my concept of reverb.
So when you use reverb, why do you use it?
I probably use it because I've got a plate reverb and I feel like I have to.
Come on, give me a real answer.
No, okay. So some of the reasons why I like reverb is it kind of glues things together. It can give it another sense of space, and it can make the music sound otherworldly. So that can be really nice. I know that conceptually, I like to think about reverb as defining where an instrument or a voice is in the space in front of me. Right.
So you use it for a sense of environment, a sense of space, a sense of positioning things in terms of how close or far away something is. Right. I mean, this is the way that this is the primary function of reverb.
Yeah.
How often do you think of reverb in rhythmic terms?
I don't know if I do. I don't know if I think or realize that I'm thinking about it. I probably respond to how it's sitting, especially when I'm dialing in a reverb against a snare drum. I might really pay attention to the tail, the length of the tail. But a lot of times I also find myself just pushing it longer and longer because, it's that like, well, I like it, so I want more of it.
Sure. Well, I mean, so what you're saying is you're conceptualizing it in terms of rhythm by feel. You're not concretely going, yes, I'm going to hear the groove as I dial in my reverb timing settings.
Right.
But a reverb is a sound that has an attack, a decay, a sustain, and a release, just like a string, just like a bass, just like a guitar, just like a snare, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sensibly speaking, it's a rhythmic element.
Yeah, so you should be able to shape it in and create a whole new element of music.
That's right. And so when you're crafting your reverb, one of the things that's really important to think about is how the timing of things like your pre-delay, your ratio of early to late reflections, the tail length and the shape of the decay, how those are all affecting the groove of the sound.
Yeah, okay, so here's an excellent example. A single hit tambourine, that's landing somewhere in the mix. A lot of times that sounds great if you put a reverb wash to go with it. But if you adjust the pre-delay a lot or too much, all of a sudden you start hearing a double attack. You hear the tambourine hit and then you hear an attack of the reverb coming in, and that totally affects the rhythm.
That's right. It can screw up your pocket. But likewise, for some elements, if there isn't any pre-delay, the reverb, if it's a reverb that has a generally quick attack to it, like the early reflection rises up fast, then you are going to mask the attack of your element a little bit. And so sometimes you have to pay attention to that as well, because if you're masking the attack, then you are losing a little bit of the punch of that rhythmic element. So when I'm working on reverb, it's not just simply a spatial concept, but it's also a tonal concept. How is this tonally coloring the sound? It's a rhythmic concept. How is this connecting with the groove of the record? You mentioned glue. Is this feeling like it's making everything bond together, or does it feel like there's reverb now lying over top of my transient elements and making the groove a little less strong? Is the pre-delay too fast, too short in terms of how it's affecting how we're hearing the beat? And this is not anything that I think you could be a total beginner and say, that sounds obvious. And you could be somebody who's been doing this for 20 years and say, I have literally never once thought of that in those terms.
Sure, absolutely. It's funny because I remember my first introduction to pre-delay for reverb. When I was interning at a studio, they had beautiful plate reverbs and they had tape machines. And so I remember my mentor came in and he showed me, he said, well, so if you plug in the plate and you want to listen to it, send it over to the 2-track first and bounce it off the tape. And what that did is that put a little bit of delay as it was printed to the tape and then played back. And then the played back version went to the reverb. And that little bit of delay brought out the clarity of the sound. So just pushing the reverb, having it start a little bit later, left a lot of focus on that first sound. So great tip.
Right. So, and that's the whole idea of these tutorials, to start really looking at things in a comprehensive way, not just in a textbook way of saying, well, when you send a sound to a reverb, the algorithm computes what it would sound like if it was in a three-dimensional space, and you have early reflections that mean this, and light reflections that mean that, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, like who cares?
I mean, that's stuff,
unless you're going to build a reverb.
Right. I mean, and that stuff is important. Like, it's important to recognize that the pre-delay function primarily is there because closer sounds will have longer pre-delays.
Yeah.
So that's important when you're placing things front to back. But that's only one effect of affecting the pre-delay. There's other things that come along with it that we need to look at as a whole. So, I mean, when I'm thinking about EQ, I don't want to just think about things in terms of you're changing the tone. I want to think about things in terms of like, okay, but there's so many ways that you can do that. Can you make the transient sound of a upright bass sound more present and therefore change the dynamic perception of a record using EQ? Yeah, absolutely, you can. And, how does the minute phase shifting that's going along, how does that function when we're working with things like drum kits that have a tied-in phase relationship between every element? Do we need to consider that when we're EQing things independently? Well, maybe we do, because we want to preserve that three-dimensional image, and we can lose that by improper use of EQ. Like, these are things that you don't need to have a degree in science to understand, but sometimes you need somebody to actually point them out to recognize.
Yeah, this is great stuff, man. I really appreciate you being so in depth with this material. It's very clear to me that you know what you're talking about. You have a lot to teach. I do have a question, though, for somebody who would be taking your courses. What is the best way to experience that? I mean, we have phones, we have laptops, we've got headphones. Some people have studios with great sounding monitors. How does someone get the most out of one of your courses, and what should they expect as that part of that process?
Well, ideally, you're not listening to me explain sound engineering off of the speaker on your phone.
Okay, fair enough. It's a good tip. It might be taken for granted.
I'm sure there's people out there, but I mean, the better your listening environment, the better in general, because when we're talking about mixing and producing records, obviously we want to be able to hear things as accurately as possible. So I encourage people to use either very high-end headphones or, the best studio setup you can, because you'll get the most out of it. But that said, it doesn't require that somebody has all the same stuff that I have. Like, you don't necessarily need the most high-end equipment. I have very high-end equipment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need it to appreciate what I'm teaching. And so it's all about ideas. It's about, the most important thing in mixing and production is the decision-making process. All of the stuff like, how do I do it? All the technical approaches and things like that can be learned over time, but formulating the decision-making process is something that has to be in the foundation of our development. So, it doesn't have to be the most amazing listening environment or anything like that. It just needs to be something where you feel like you can do adequate work and adequate assessment of what you're hearing.
Yeah, so maybe the place that is your favorite place to listen to records, which hopefully isn't off of your speaker on your phone.
Yeah, preferably not.
Well, all right. Awesome. Matthew, thank you so much. I know we've been on a roll here, and I'd like to take a moment and then go into the jam session with you. Are you feeling like you ready to jam for a minute?
I was born ready to jam for my whole life.
I knew it. Okay, cool. Well, so Rockstars, a reminder to you that you can find links to all this stuff. I'm going to make sure to include it in the show notes. And if you're listening on your iPhone right now, all you have to do is open up the podcast app. And then if you're looking at this episode of the podcast, you probably see the Rockstars logo there. Press that with your finger. It'll zip up like a window shade, and you'll see the show notes right there, and you can just link through and go check this stuff out. It'll take you straight over to Matthew's site and check all those things out. So we're going to the jam session. We'll see you in just one sec. Hey everybody, it's Lid Shaw, and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Recording Studio Rockstars. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your time. And as a way of saying thank you, I've created a special mix tutorial just for you, Rockstars, totally free, called the Mix Master Bundle. With it, you get over 2 hours of detailed videos watching over my shoulder as I mix a song in my studio. Plus, I give you the free ebook that explains how I recorded the tracks, And you get downloadable multi-tracks so that you can practice your mixes, including the Pro Tools session file, using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools, all of which you would find in any other DAW, whether you're on Logic or Studio One or Reaper. Maybe you're struggling with trying to improve your mix technique, or maybe you just simply don't have access to multi-track files or can't record a full drum set in your studio. I wanted to give you a chance to create your own mixes from full drum kit, bass, and guitars recorded in my studio. The song is called American Winter, and it's off my instrumental record Skadoosh, and it's all available for you totally free right now. All you need to do to get it is text Mix Master Bundle to 33444, and I'll send it directly to your email. Again, that's Mix Master Bundle with no space to 33444, or you can go directly to mixmasterbundle.com, enter your email, and I'll send all the files directly to you. Thanks so much, rock stars. We'll see you guys in the jam session. Cheers. It's Lid Shaw, and we're back here at Recording Studio Rockstars. We're about to jump into the jam session. My guest is Matthew Weiss. Matthew, are you ready to jam?
I sure hope so.
Awesome, dude. Well, so tell us, when you started out in recording, what was holding you back? What was the big obstacle for you?
Money.
Awesome.
I don't have any money. It's really hard to go places and do things when you're working at a pizza shop, but you make do.
Yeah. But you found a way to just kind of continue despite that, huh?
I lived with my mother.
Well done. I like that, man. I like the honesty in that too. Do whatever you can. You did say you would do anything you could to see a record through and make sure it was the greatest you could do. And if it starts out with delivering pizzas and living at home with your parents, then so be it. That's a great place to start.
Yeah, I have no pride. If I have to go back there, I'll do it again. I hope not.
Right.
I hope not. But, I'll do what I have to do.
Well, so tell us, what was some of the best advice you received?
Some of the best advice I received.
Yeah, maybe something at the beginning when you were starting out in recording.
Yeah, this is an anecdote I like to tell. I was backstage at a concert going on at Temple University, and KRS-One was the headliner, and I got a chance to talk to him backstage. And I asked him, I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, but I sort of asked him, like, what's the magic key to success? And he said to me, if you really want to stand in your own light, help somebody else stand in theirs.
Wow, I love that, man. That's brilliant.
Yeah, and that pretty much shaped my entire career.
I think Jesus might have said something like that, too, once upon a time.
It was either KRS-One or Jesus. They're very, very similar.
Right on, man. All right, so now share with us a favorite recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that our listeners could take home and use right now.
Understand the instrument you're recording.
Cool. What? Give us an anecdote.
If you want to get the best sound, sonically speaking, from a voice, the best way to do that is to understand the mechanisms that go into vocal performance. Because if you know those mechanisms, you will get such an improvement of sound at the source. You can throw up a bullshit microphone going into a bullshit preamp and still actually get, sonically speaking, good results.
Is there, do you actually have a course that teaches you how to do some of that, or talk specifically about vocals?
I don't, and I would love to make one. It is very intensive, but there have been very few instruments over the course of my lifetime that I haven't investigated thoroughly by talking to the musicians who've been playing them for years about how those instruments work. And when you understand how they work, it opens up a lot more abilities in terms of getting the recordings that you want. Guitars, you're a guitar player, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're playing an acoustic, that the depth at which you hold the pick, whether you're up toward the top of the pick or you're down to the bottom of the pick, will give you a slightly different dynamic shape to your strum. And you also know that depending on how far you push into the strings, you will get a different tonality from the guitar.
Yep. I have made guitar players, acoustic guitar players, so miserable sometimes getting them to try out 5 different picks when we're recording.
But when you know that that affects the sound, tell me what's going to ultimately yield the better sonics, technically speaking, doing that or using an EQ?
Oh, there's no way I could change the pick with an EQ. I mean, you could probably do some cool tricks. I feel like, David Bowie, rest in peace. His acoustic guitars are some of the most amazing and bizarre, like otherworldly sounding acoustics. And I think it was a combination of, thin picks, old K acoustics and probably brilliant EQs at the mix point.
Sure. Well, you want to get everything in line, but the fact is that if you understand the actual architecture of how instruments work and function, you can craft the sound so much better at the source than you ever could afterwards, that you're truly engineering the sound in a more productive way. So that is, I think, probably the best advice I can give to any recording engineer.
Well, thank you for that. That's a great tip. All right, so now, next question. Give us or share with us, tell us about a favorite hardware tool for the studio, something that when you're making records, you're always glad you've got it around.
Oh, man, I've got a Fairchild clone. I love my hardware. A lot of it's modded to do what I want it to do. I got a Bricasti reverb recently. That thing sounds like, oh, God, it sounds so good. You're making me really nerdy right now.
It's all right. Nerd out if you feel it.
But yeah, I mean, I picked out all of this stuff for very specific purposes. Not all of it's expensive. I've got a drummer punch gate. That's like a $300 unit, and I use it all the time. I've got a Bellari tube exciter, and it's been modified because it doesn't come stock sounding so great. But, couple of little swaps, and it sounds pretty darn nice. And that's not a very expensive unit. And then I've got a $7,000 compressor. And that's an expensive unit, but it sounds really, really good.
When you get a $7,000 compressor, should you prepare yourself for the compressor that you're using to be worth more than a handful of the records that first get mixed through it?
I prepare myself to continue to not own a car.
Right. Well done. And you're in, you said you're in Boston now, but you are not going to be in Boston for forever, right?
I'm going to be going to LA without a car because I decided to buy a compressor.
Nice.
So when I give out advice, please understand that there is a certain grain of salt in terms of practicality that maybe should be observed.
Well, I mean, you're genuinely dedicated. I mean, you sleep under consoles, live at home with mom, and deliver pizzas to bring us, and spend $7,000 on a compressor to bring us the best record you can. So,
thankfully, I don't live with my mother anymore. With that, we left that phase a number of years ago. But absolutely, this is my life. I barely leave the apartment because I'm constantly working on records. So why do I need a car? I don't need a car.
All right. So share with us a favorite software tool for the studio.
Oh boy! Again, there's so many of them.
You can just drop a couple, one good golden nugget of knowledge on us. You already did.
Waves in phase seems to keep making its way into my life because this sort of goes back to that getting it right at the source thing. It's one of the few things that you can do in terms of processing that actually adjusts the source recording, and getting a perfect phase relationship between things like a mic'd bass cabinet and a bass DI. Mm-hmm. is pretty irreplaceable. And
so this plugin makes it really easy to do that?
Yes.
Was it designed for live recording and it's getting used on mixing a lot, or is it essentially just ready for both?
There is a version that's it's set up to do things live. I don't know how you can possibly adjust timing without creating latency. Like that doesn't really, but I mean, I guess maybe there's some kind of magical mystery way of doing that.
Maybe there's like a little gremlin inside the plugin.
Yeah.
That does it all for us. All right. So tell us about a resource for the business side of making records, running your recording studio, producing music, some tip that would really help people out.
This is the place where we all sort of fall face down. And it's something that I'm still learning as well. I haven't found too many great resources on doing the business side of things. So I would love it if your listeners could actually send me their suggestions. I had been checking out accountants and ultimately decided to do my own. And I've talked to managers and ultimately I've decided to be my own manager. And I've had assistants before, like secretarial assistants, and all of them have been, unfortunately, fired by yours truly. They've never made it more than maybe, I think the longest was a couple of months.
Wow.
So I end up doing everything myself, and I end up, goofing around. I write my own contracts because I have yet to find any resource that really helps with any of that, which is sad, I think.
Well, maybe that's the advice is, obviously you've had resources for learning how to do that stuff, whether you've,
Oh,
read
Google
about
is
it or heard it.
amazing. Google is fantastic.
Yeah.
If you want to know things like, what goes into a split sheet, you can, or if you just want a split sheet, you can Google that and you will not only get a blank copy of a split sheet that you can print right out of your printer, but you will also get a detailed explanation of exactly what it is, what it means, and what it does.
Very cool. All right. So I would take your tip to be learn how to do it and take care of it yourself if you can until you find somebody better.
Yeah, be self-sufficient no matter what you're doing, because, at the very least, if I find somebody who can do this stuff better than I can, when I talk to them, at least I'll know what they're talking about.
Yeah. All right. All right. So now here comes a hypothetical question. If you were starting out all over again, you had to move to a new city, you didn't know anybody. I guess you're going to LA, but you know some people. But if you were starting out, you didn't know anybody, you needed a simple setup to record with and start your recording career. You needed to find people to work with and make music with. And meanwhile, you needed to make ends meet, which you kind of answered that part of the question by saying deliver pizzas and live at home with mom if you need to. What would you do? What would you take with you? How would you meet people? How would you make ends meet to start out? Obviously, this might be directed towards people who are in that boat right now.
Well, boy, that's a very, very tough question. Starting out is probably the hardest thing to do. So I would say, you need a laptop because you're going to need to be able to do things in terms of communicating with people, setting up a website, and also the actual work that you're doing. So you need a laptop. I don't know what budget we're on here in this hypothetical universe, but whatever budget that you can get for equipment, put a good amount to your necessities in terms of an interface, a respectable microphone. My first real microphone was an Audio-Technica 4033A. I bought it for $250. I still have it and still use it.
Mine's set up in front of the drums right now.
Fantastic. It's a great mic. It's legitimately a good mic. And, when you're buying gear, I always say, try and buy the stuff that you're going to keep. Even if it means spending a little more early on, that cost difference becomes pretty negligible 10 years down the line. By the difference between buying the Audio-Technica for $250 versus buying something like a Samsung CO2 for $90 is that in 10 years, you've effectively spent a penny a day more for your better microphone, but you didn't throw your microphone out or have to resell it because it turns out it's a piece of crud. So, buy stuff that you intend to keep. And don't forget to save money for the fact that there are expenses on the way up. A lot of the times when I was getting started, and actually the way I got my first studio position, I was telling bands that I'm not going to charge you. And even if you need help to pay for the studio time, I will help pay for the studio time. I will pay to work. And as crazy as that sounds, that's how you got to form these relationships in some way, shape, or form. You have to make these connections happen. So, be selective about who you're working with and what expenses come with that. But recognize that these are the people that are going to ultimately help you shape your career. And in the process, you can hopefully help them shape theirs.
That's great, man. And I think you may have just answered the final question, but I'll ask it anyway. What is the single most important thing that our listeners can do to become a rock star of the recording studio themselves?
Get into the studio.
There you go. I like it, man. Just get in. Get started.
Get in there. Whatever sacrifices you have to make, trust me, it's look at what goes into going to a place like Full Sail. What is Full Sail now? It's like $35,000 a year, $40,000 a year.
I thought it was even more than that, but you're probably right.
It might be more than that, or maybe SAE is something like that. But it's like we're talking something close to, all said and done, you're going to be up near six figures by the time you're out of there. Mm-hmm. What is going into a studio and buying studio time yourself in the face of that? Everybody, whether you're going to college to get your degree in finance, it's a sacrifice in the beginning. You incur debt. Or you pay out of pocket to get an education, to get access to people, to form connections and network and expand what you're doing. And after you make that sacrifice, the idea of the investment is that it pays off down the road. So, be willing to make the sacrifices and realize that they're not as big as you think they are when you're making them.
Yeah, and I think a reminder too to people is that when you're spending some money to learn the craft, like you're taking tutorials, you're learning this stuff, you're investing in yourself. And it's that process of investing in yourself that ultimately generates this great reward.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't mean to shameless pitch the living hell out of my tutorials, but I would hope that if you're about to walk into your first internship, one where you're at a studio where conceivably you could be making connections with big clients or people who can elevate your career, I would hope that when you look at a product like my tutorial, you would say, okay, this might cost me $120 to get all of the tutorials that I feel like would cover everything I'm trying to do. But I would hope that you would be okay with making that sacrifice if you know that stepping into the next situation you're about to step into, you're going to be way more prepared.
Yeah, I think that better advice is hold onto your wallet when you're riding the bus home after that first
Seriously,
gig.
like
you would have just made 170.
Absolutely. Spending money in a smart way is way better than losing money in a dumb way.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, I think that's a great note to close out on. So thank you so much for being here on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. Would you like to let our rock stars know how they can find you or learn more about you?
I'm a content provider at theproaudiofiles.com. It's an excellent blog and a free resource for learning all this kind of stuff. You can also go to theproaudiofiles.com/members. That's the paid version, and it allows you to see all of my videos and also allows you to see all of another engineer named David Glenn Culp's videos if you join that site. But there's also, if the streaming thing is not your jam, then you can simply find the tutorials for download and purchase as well. And for my actual contact, like, hey, here's Matt, you can go to www.weiss-sound.com or, coming very soon, www.weissadvice.com.
Nice, man. I love it. I think I remembered hearing you go through the naming process on that. It's a great
I put it up on Facebook, and that thread is epic.
It is. It's good stuff. Thank you, Matthew, so much for being with us here on Recording Studio Rockstars. Really appreciate it.
Hey, man, thank you for having me. It was really fun to talk to you. I hope that your listeners have enjoyed it.
All right. Cheers, man. I'll see you around the studio.
All right. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.